What are the reasons why, when we know somewhat the causes, when we know already what are the solutions, and things are still not being done? Isabel, how much does it have to do with central government, local government relations, particularly in handling a regional issue? Tell me more about that.
Well, all of these things are choices. You know, if you close down everything that was burning coal in China tomorrow and banned all the traffic from Beijing, you'd have clear air in 2 weeks, but you'd also have an economic crisis. So all of these choices are balanced between what the economy needs and the environmental effects. Within that, there are a whole sets of sub-choices. If you're asking me why it hasn't gone faster in China, and I have to say that it's not that there hasn't been progress in China. We've had a lot of new laws, and until the upturn in heavy industry, things were improving. It just got bad again in 2016. But if you look at what are your instruments and how serious is your political will, look at the US EPA, for instance. That employs nearly 20,000 people, 19,000 people on a national level. And in a state like California alone, you've got 1,200 people concerned only with air quality. Look at the Chinese Ministry of Environmental Protection, which does its best and is full of sincere people trying very hard. There are a few hundred. So, you know, you have to think, how much political will is really behind this? And if you really want to solve it, it's going to take more investment, more commitment.
Okay, certainly it's more than just the Ministry
funds.
of Environmental Protection. We all well understand that is something that we all need to bear in mind. Many believe that we are now here in China experiencing what developed countries and economies suffered decades ago. If you take a look at some of these photos, the Great Smog of 1952 in London was a severe air pollution event that killed over 4,000 people, while over 100,000 fell ill. Then back in 1950s and 60s, people in Los Angeles in the US breathed some of the dirtiest air in the world. Both London and LA still have smog. Of course, it's not nearly as bad as it used to be at all. But the question we need to ask is, Tao, do we have to hit the same wall that the others have already? If we don't, is there urgently something that we can do here? Earlier, Isabel was talking about political will. So much public sentiment, isn't there enough for the political will?
Well, I think what we have seen from countries to country and over times in the history is that there is some kind of replications of what experienced in the developed countries. And developing countries, to some extent, is still replicated, even though we have seen many times that we could avoid taking the same old path of the developed countries. But still, the industrializations and then the post-industrialization is the path that development will take. So in the short word, yes, we are replicating them, but we can actually do better. And because China is actually developing so fast, so we probably give us more difficulties to solve all those issues and to handle it properly in such a short period of time. I think Isabel just mentioned very correctly, the technology is there, but the key issue is where you strike the balance. We can't have all those APEC blue and parade blue, all those things, because we know how to turn down those polluters. We know where to tackle those sources. We know the technology could help us to achieve it. But if we continue to do that for a longer period, that is going to be a huge cost of the economy. And whether we're going to sustain that for our today's economy, for today's society, that's a question. So the balance is very difficult for
But I think there is already, Dr. Wang, if I could be blunt here,
Please.
Very strong both public and political consensus all over China about doing something about this. Let's go into some details as to where the problems are.
Yes.
Or the loopholes are, the holes that are big enough that we are still seeing so much smog these days. Monitoring. There are monitoring stations being established. It takes a lot of bucks, by the way, by the Chinese central government. All over the northern China area, particularly in some of those severely polluted areas. And yet, reports suggested, Dr. Wang, you know this better than I do, some were being turned off while the production was going on.
That's true. I discussed this with some people.
You help us to understand what does it take to make sure the monitors will work?
Well, I think the monitor should work by technology, But who turning them off, that is a motivation that we have to look into and try to solve that and to tackle that incentives.
What do you think?
We do believe, and we also saying that, for example, I'll give you an example, during this last round of the smogs in Beijing, we can look at some of the maps, the real data maps provided by the Ministry of Environment Protections with the real data of the emissions from the polluters. And you can see that even during those severe smogs, those data are still red, which means they are actually violating the standards during the smog time. And you could argue that we could just now already sue them for the for the emissions of the higher than standard emission, but it's difficult because they could say this is equipment issues. It cannot be at this moment being used as a legal basis to sue them, and they are still rely on the local enforcement to take samples and to sue them, and this is what Isabel mentioned.
But Isabel, you know, what Tao said here, clearly understood, but you have to rely on local enforcement. I mean, you cannot send a team to go all over China 24 hours a day to any place at the same time.
That's
so
right.
you have to rely on local enforcement. That is the question. How can you strike a balance so that some of the key stakeholders are understanding that they have a stake also here, and their stake, to a certain extent, is being protected for their future? Isabel.
Well, you have to ensure, I agree that local enforcement is critical, but you have to ensure that the people charged with local enforcement are independent and that their mission is to the environment and that they're not obliged in any way or dependent in any way on local power holders, because as long as they are, then you're going to get a conflict of interest, and the conflict of interest leads to poor enforcement. I mean, it's very hard to predict or to prescribe for China, but I can tell you that in the United States, for instance, government action was very important, local enforcement was very important, but in order for that to happen, there were certain key elements that really helped. One is transparency of data, so you can see what's happening, and China's made great strides in that respect, and digital technology really helps because it's much harder to hide. The second thing is a robust media. You know, naming, shaming, reporting, you know, challenging, these are all key factors in making polluters think twice about whether they can get away with it. And the third one is rule of law. It's the importance of robust civil society groups, environmental campaigners being able to take cases to court and make sure that polluters pay enormously. As long as it's cheaper to pollute, polluters will continue. If it's more expensive to pollute, then, you know, they will switch on the scrubber and they will use the equipment that is available. The problem is not that it's not available, it's a problem that it costs money to run and I can get away with not running it, you know.
Right. To shame it, to punish it, to make sure rules are being followed. That is the solution. But Tao, China is new to a modern country system. Rule of law, things like that, and also active transparency in the existing system has been issues that we all work very hard on. At this point, smog, though, is such an urgent issue.
That's right.
So chicken and egg, which comes first? Will dealing with smog help us to figure out an efficient way of dealing with some of the existing challenges, as we mentioned earlier, all these problems?
Well, first of all, I think I would say that I agree with what Isabel said. It's exactly what these three very important elements that we need. And secondly, I think what we really think about for China is those participations is already there and the technology is there. What we need to look at this is not by looking at them as chicken or egg. It's actually look at the smog as an issue where the government could set examples to demonstrate their willingness or resolution to solve this issue as an example, and then to be replicated to much wider environmental issues, social challenges, and other issues. So I think I would add one more element to what Isabel just mentioned. In China, we look at examples. And a lot of the local officials are very sensitive about examples set by central government. There are local officials being promoted for their economic performance, so they will place the economic performance higher than the environmental protections. Unless we see some of the officials being punished for their environmental degradations, pollutions, which I think I said already, earlier in your program, we wouldn't be able to see them to make the change, and the incentives would not be taken away.
We talk about China. Is it really unique? Some say it is, but others say not. So let's take a look at some of the things that we probably could compare and have some inspirations from. Compared with developed countries in the same period of time, China's environmental improvement, according to Mr. Chen Jining, China's Minister of Environmental Protection, actually is par for the course. That means the direction of China's atmospheric administration is on track. This is what he said. But many begin to ask that question. Being a well-respected official and a scholar himself, Minister Chen is stating the fact. And yet, Isabel, people are asking, could there be China speed when it comes to resolving also the issue of smog? Because China is enjoying its speed of development. Chinese work very hard for its economic development and also social development and achieve amazing miracles. But can that also be replicated in dealing with smog? Isabel, what would you think?
Well, it would be great to see China's speed applied to this. It would be really good for Chinese people. I think, my problem with the way the issue is framed is that, yeah, there was a China miracle, absolutely, in terms of GDP headline growth, and everybody recognizes it brought people out of poverty. It was deeply impressive, but it was following a model that Britain had followed 150 years before. And the results of that model were absolutely clear. They were clear in the smog in Britain that we talked about earlier, culminating in the great disaster of 1952.
Right.
Equally, if you look at Chinese urban design, and we haven't talked much about traffic, but that's another big thing. China kind of chose to turn Beijing into a version of Los Angeles. Well, Los Angeles in the 1960s and 70s had the worst air quality. If you do that, you know what the result is going to be.
So what is your point, Isabel?
I don't think that... Well, my point is that it would be great if China hadn't felt or didn't feel that it had to take all the bad lessons from what we did and take some of the good lessons instead. Now, some of the good lessons are that, you have to learn to count your economy not just in terms of GDP growth, but in terms of the damage that pollution does. You have to do a much more all-round assessment of the economy. Damage in terms of health, material damage, cost to the, sickness and death cost as well. But the other great advantage that China has, and it might produce some China speed, is, as Wang Tao says, the technology is much more advanced now. And also, China has taken a high-level strategic decision to become greener. And China sees its future as a green power. And that's really important because it means that investment can be channeled in to renewable energy, as it has been, to developing newer, cleaner technologies. And that's very important. That's an advantage China has that nobody else did have.
Yes, I do want Dr. Wang here to also respond to that. We all remember the moment when Chinese President Xi Jinping was shaking hands with still the current President of the United States, President Obama, about the Climate Change Pact. That was such a historical moment.
Yes.
Even though climate change does not necessarily equals to our ability of handling the smog. But that is already a great example. China could take that stride toward the right direction.
That's right.
What about China's speed? Is there a possibility of solving this problem? We all hate smog with the China speed.
I think, as Isabel mentioned, there is potential for China to have a faster progress compared with developed countries to solve this issue. We have the good technologies, we have the better knowledges, and also much stronger willingness of the political leaderships. So it's possible. But also we have to remember that because of this very fast development, we also accumulate two types of pollutions, as just Isabel mentioned. And at the same time, we have the smog both from the coal, like London, and also from the transportation, like Los Angeles. So that makes this a much more complicated background of the pollution for us to take. So I still remains optimistic about the speed that we're going to solve it. As you can see that Isabel believes that we take 20 or 30 years, and I believe maybe 10 to 15 years. It's faster than either London or Los Angeles in the history record. But in general, I think we still have to be also realistic that this is not going to be solved over a year, and we should be more patient and also take step by step.
What are you going to do if it's not solved over the night?
Well, we cannot solve this overnight, but I think we
So
just
what can you
discussed.
do? What are you going to do? Are you going to travel outside the country to escape the smog, or take a vacation, or?
Protect ourselves better by using equipment, but also
Okay.
remains patient and also active to advising government on taking those necessary steps to tackle that.
Before we go, one final sentence. I have to emphasize once again a sentence, Isabel. What to do? First step. Concise, please.
First step, speed up the phase out of coal.
Okay, Tao.
I think we need to look at the example. So I'm really looking forward to see someone being punished for the environmental pollutions.